Hello again, amazing teachers, and welcome to Module 5, How to Manage Centers. Now, we've talked about what they are, the different types, how to introduce them, but now we have to decide how we're going to manage them. There are lots of different ways to manage centers, and really they kind of stretch this whole spectrum from completely teacher-directed all the way to completely student-directed, with a lot of different types in between that are a combination of those two. So we're going to talk about some of the most common ways to do it. I'm going to share with you what my experiences have been with the different types of center management, and then you'll be able to choose what you think is going to work the best for you. So the most teacher-directed way to manage centers is to have a scheduled rotation system. And this is exactly what it sounds like. You put the students in groups, you set up how they're going to rotate through those centers, you tell them where to go, how long to stay there, who they're going with, and what they do while they're there. They really don't have choice whenever you do it this way. It is 100% you directing what they need to do. You typically would need to have some kind of a chart in your room if you're going to choose this type of center management, so that there's a visual that shows them what center they're going to, where they go next. Makes it a little bit easier to manage if you have a visual that shows exactly what they're going to do. Now, let's talk about some of the benefits of having a completely teacher-directed management system. First of all, you can make sure that every student does every center and every activity. You can control which students work together, which when there's personality conflicts, that can be really helpful. And movement during centers is minimized. They aren't getting to choose where they go or how long they stay there, so they're pretty much going to stay where you tell them to until it's time for everybody to get up and move to something different. There are some negatives to this approach as well. The students might get off task a little bit more if they're in a center that they're not interested in. Or if they're not interested in the activity that you've assigned in that center. If they're not interested in it, you guys know they're going to act up. So you may have more behavior problems if you do the teacher-directed approach to this. The activities might be too hard or too easy for the students if everyone's doing the same thing. The rotation might end before they're finished, and that can make them really mad. If they're not done, they want to finish, and they just might not get to if that timer goes off and they aren't done with their task yet. Or they might finish their work before the rotation ends, and then what are they going to do? So there are definitely some downsides to being completely teacher-directed. Now, let's go to the opposite end of the spectrum and look at the completely student-directed way to manage centers. This is complete free choice. So the students get to choose where they go, who they go with, how long they stay, what they do while they're there. If they're done with one center, they can just simply clean up and move to another one. You don't need a rotation chart because there is no rotation. The students just go wherever they want to. Now, there are some positives with this. It sounds like it could be a bit chaotic, but there are some positives to complete student choice. They are going to stay more engaged because they are choosing the centers and activities that interest them. When it no longer interests them, they can move somewhere else, and so then they'll be engaged in that new center. They can work until they're finished since there's no forced rotations. Now, the exception to that is if they go to a center right before center time is over. But for the most part, they're going to go to the ones they want to do the most right at the beginning, and so they will have time typically to finish up what they're doing in that center that's near and dear to their heart. They can select a different center or activity when they're finished, since they're not waiting on the timer to tell them when to rotate. And this might sound like a negative, but it's actually a positive. They're going to encounter more problem-solving opportunities, interacting with other students, sharing space, sharing materials, if it is completely based on student choice. Now, there are some negatives as well. Too many students may choose the same center. If you just let them go wherever, you might end up with the new, fun, exciting center completely overcrowded. There's lots of movement during center time whenever they have complete free choice. Students might choose the same center every single time. Now, I would tell you that's not necessarily a bad thing, because if they're choosing that center, there's a reason why. However, I know because we are basing our centers on the standards, we need for them to do more than just one center every day. And they're on the opposite end of that. There might be centers that they never choose. If it's something that is challenging for them or they've never been exposed to before, they might never be exposed to it because they aren't going to be asked to go choose that center. Okay, so that was the two extremes. However, most teachers end up using a management system that's somewhere in the middle of those two, a combination of teacher directed and student directed. And there's a few different ways that you can accomplish that as well. So one way that you can do that is with population control. You can have some kind of a system at each center, a pocket chart or library pockets on the shelf, where they put a name tag, or maybe they put a clothespin on a dot, and the dots or the openings for the name tags tell you how many students can be in that center. So you decide how many students are in each center to keep the crowd down to a reasonable number for the activity, for the materials, for the space that's available. And then if you have a system where you rotate who gets to choose first, they're always going to have days where they get to pick their very favorite center, but they're also going to have days where they're the last one to choose, and they may go somewhere that ordinarily they wouldn't choose on their own. So even though you're not making them rotate through all of the centers, the way that you set up the rotation of who chooses is going to, we'll call it, encourage them to try different things and to visit all of the centers at some point. Now, they still, when you do it this way, will get to work until they're finished and move to a different center when they need to. However, they can only move to a different center if there's a spot available. So, maybe they really want to go to the Dramatic Play Center, but nobody leaves that center. Well, then they wouldn't be able to go to that center that day. They would have to choose something different. Maybe they really want to play the math game that you put out, but there's 4 people, they're playing, that center is full, so they're going to have to wait. They'll have to choose something different. So it gives them choice, but it gives them choice within the structure that you've put into place by establishing how many people can be at each center. And then that kind of indirectly affects a lot of the other aspects of the parameters of their choice as well. Another way that you can combine teacher-directed and student-directed management of your centers is to have must-do centers. So maybe you have 4 activities, let's say 4 activities that you want every student to complete during the week. So those become the must-do centers, and you mark them somehow, maybe with a star, maybe with a certain color. So they know all of the gold centers I have to do, or all of the star centers I have to do. And over the course of the week, they have to do those 4 activities, but then beyond that, they get choice of the other activities that they do. You could have a chart on the wall, and as they choose those must-do centers, you mark off that they've done it. They could have a chart inside an individual chart inside of like a folder, or at their desk, or at their table, where they're marking off the ones that they have done that are must-do centers. And as you get towards the end of the week, if it's Thursday and little Susie hasn't done any of the must-do centers, at that point, then you would kind of force her hand. All right, honey, you've got these 4 centers that you have to do by the end of the day tomorrow, so which one would you like to do now? She still gets to choose, but you're limiting her choices to make sure that those must-do centers get done. And then the last thing that you can do is alternating rotations and free choice. But to do this, time is a factor. You have to have more than 1 center time during your day. And so maybe the first time that they do centers, it's a rotation. And those activities that might have become the must-do activities that we were talking about just a minute ago would be what they rotate through. So you put them in groups. Maybe they rotate through a sight word center, a phonics center, a writing activity, and some kind of reading comprehension activity. So you have those 4 different centers, and they rotate through during that first block of time. But then when you come back later, maybe in the afternoon when they're not quite as focused, you do choice centers. And so then they would get to choose, and you might add in the exploration centers, add in the games, add in the more open-ended things, as opposed to the skill-based centers. So they are still getting a taste of student-directed each day, but you're coupling that with the teacher-directed to make sure that they're doing what you need for them to do. Now, I will tell you, I have tried pretty much all of these different approaches over my 20 years as a teacher. So let me just kind of share with you what my experiences were. The complete teacher-directed just did not work for me. I am always erring on the side of student direction, student-led, and T-Test does that as well, so that's something to consider when you're deciding how you want to set these up. T-Test is always pushing us toward student-led, 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 so we want to make sure that we're moving in that direction. So I would discourage the complete teacher-directed. Only having scheduled rotations is not student-led at all. It just didn't work for me. The complete free choice, I tried that as well. And I just felt like, as much as I would love for my students to completely be in charge of their own learning, they needed a little bit more direction than that. I needed to be able to influence what they were doing so that I could make sure they were practicing the skills that I needed them to practice. So I ended up landing on a combination of teacher-led and student-led. My favorite was the population control. I got little pocket charts. You can get them typically in the dollar spot at Target during back to school time. They're super cheap. If you want 3 students to go, you leave 3 of the lines empty. And then I just printed off cards with stop signs. I can send a file to you with that if you need it on the other ones. So when the 3 empty ones were full, that was it. No one else could go there, and they knew that. It takes a lot of training in the beginning, but once they know how to do it, it runs itself. I've also tried the must do. Well, let me back up a minute. With the population control, that to me works more effectively with younger students. Pre-K and kinder, it works very well with. It does still work with older kids, but my preference is to use that with the younger ones. The must do works better with the older ones. First and second grade, it's optimal for them because they're old enough to really manage their own choices and their own learning much better than our pre-K and kinder students are. I always like to do it where they had a folder with a sheet in it and there was a grid, and if they did the must-do center on Monday, they would color it red. If they did it on Tuesday, they would color it orange. Yellow for Wednesday, green for Thursday, blue for Friday. My brain just thinks in rainbow colors, and so that's how I had it set up. And every day whenever it was time to do centers, I would get their folders out one by one, and I would ask them, what center are you doing today? And if they said, I'm going to do blocks, and it was the 3rd time they've done blocks, but they hadn't done any of the other must-do centers, then I would encourage them, look, honey, you haven't colored any of these yet, so you need to choose one of these. Which one of these are you going to do? And then they would take their folder and they would go to that center. You can do it with a chart on the wall, laminate it, use a dry erase marker, and just check it off. But somehow you do have to keep track of what centers they're doing. So for me, that was a lot more effective with like the 1st and 2nd graders. I've used it all the way up to 3rd and 4th grade. And they had a folder, like I said, and they could manage that themselves. And I just checked in with them as we went through the week. And then the last thing, alternating rotations and choice. I've done that as well. And I distinguished it with my kids by saying we had stations in the morning and we had centers in the afternoon. So during stations, they rotated through 4 core academic stations with different activities that I needed for them to work on. And then in the afternoon, they got to choose. Some of them would still choose those academic centers and keep working on those skills, but they had other options as well. That really is effective with any age. I've had success with that across the board. Like I said, my preference is the population control, but that doesn't mean it's your preference. So you just kind of have to think about your personality, the level of control you want to have over what they're doing during centers, and then once your kiddos start with you in the fall, you got to take their personalities into consideration as well. You really want to evaluate how much control they can handle, and it might be that you have to start more teacher directed and gradually work into letting it be more student led. But the key, no matter how you do it, is to find the best balance of teacher directed and student directed to establish those boundaries and those procedures for your centers in a way that works for you and for your students so that they can maximize their learning whenever they're working in your centers.